Thanks, Richard.
Thanks.
I've got a lapel mic. I don't know, can you hear me? Okay, so maybe I'll try that. If you have problems hearing me, then I'll pick up this mic. We don't have much time because I didn't realize Richard was going to take up 35 minutes of my time. But no, thank you, Richard. That was kind. So how many people feel that there's some kind of change coming in the real estate industry, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years? How many people feel? Okay, so we have a fairly converted audience here. I think part of my job is to say, well, what would the research literature, what would past experience in other industries, what would all of the research that I could do to provide and give you some clarity as to this whole situation? Well, being that I'm an academic, first thing I thought of is how can I get out of doing a bunch of work? And what I found was this is actually pretty easy because there's a fellow in Vancouver named David Eads who actually attended a session with Canadian Real Estate Association and provided absolute clarity on what's going on. And beyond that, he even posted it on his website. So I'm going to show you the answer and you can see. So as you can see, this is a very clear model. Actually, it's very confusing, and maybe we'll get David sometime to share all this, but one thing I want to draw your attention to is on the top, it says disruptive change. Disruptive change is what's driving all of this thought process that's in David's model. And so what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about what disruptive change is, maybe talk a little bit about how disruptive change has worked in other industries. We developed at the Haskayne School a model on how people respond to disruptive change, so I'll share that with you. And finally, how does all that tie into the real estate industry? Well, I said finally. That's not the last step, because actually the last step is I've got a whole bunch of data, survey of the brokers in Alberta and BC. More importantly, survey of the people who are here. Thank you very much for filling out the survey. Some interesting stuff that came out of that. So let's move on. Does anybody recognize this fellow? Henry Ford. Henry Ford and his Model T. Henry Ford really changed the world with a disruptive innovation called the Model T. And a lot of people know the story of how this happened. What you may not know is in 1900, before Henry started off, there were 1,800 car manufacturers in the U.S. 1,800 car manufacturers in the U.S. There was about 3,000 cars in the U.S. So it was very much a customized shop experience. And basically you made a choice. You either bought a car or a house, because that's how much it cost. Now I have a question for you. Henry Ford took that model where car costs, depending on what you did in your customized arrangement, somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000, and drilled it down by 1908 to $800, and by 1916 to $325, which even if you bring to today's value, that's only $17,000. How did Henry Ford take the price down to $325? Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, if you don't know the person next to you, to introduce yourself to that person and have a little discussion and just see what you think about how did he drive the price down. Okay, so maybe let's get some ideas on the table. So what are some thoughts about what are the things that Henry Ford might have done? Okay, do we have any ideas? Raise your hand. It's just like a classroom. Yes. Assembly line. What's an assembly line? Okay, so breaking down the tasks, and you do one task over and over again. The people just sort of huddle around and all in one spot around the car when they do that? No, spread out. The car is moving. Yeah, okay, great, great. So that's one way. That brought the price down. There's other things though. Yes?
He went to his suppliers and promised to sell 500 cars, so then he needed 500 goods.
Excellent point. So when you can guarantee a large quantity, you can get some economies of scale. working closely with suppliers. Excellent. So, and that's why Henry Ford built a very strong relationship with a guy named Harvey Firestone and with the Carnegies and the steel and so on and so forth. So, excellent point. Yes? Yes. Henry Ford said you can have any color you want as long as it's black. And that's great because that goes to a concept called standardization. So if everything is standardized, it's the same, then you have strong quality control. You go up that experience curve and people get to know what they're doing and they're very consistent with it and it works every time. Anything else?
There was so much more to New York Main Street in New York than people driving past. It was great that they were close to one past.
It was great for, sorry?
It was great that they got rid of all of the cars.
Yes, so the cars did not, even though there's fumes come out, it's not solid. So that's kind of a nice thing.
At some point, didn't they start selling like a byproduct of their factory, and they created a new company and got themselves an additional revenue stream?
Okay, so Alan's talking about additional revenue streams, so they expanded into new areas. Yeah? What are some other thoughts?
They really eliminated choice.
They really eliminated choice, so very much standardized it. Yes? Cheaper labor, yeah. So you might even set up plants in areas that have poor economic drivers, could really use it, and then you get some cheap labor. Anything else? Think outside the box. Yes?
I guess I was thinking along with the cheaper labor, they were able to take the common man to do this. You didn't need to have a specialized trade.
Right. So when you break it down in the assembly line to individual tasks, it's much easier to train somebody. They don't have to be a rocket scientist to crank one bolt. Okay, great. What else do you need? Zico?
He had a vision.
He had a vision. That's great. And the vision was?
So that everybody could afford a car.
Everybody could afford a car. So it was, and he actually had a great term for it, democratizing the automobile. So that it went from being just for the rich and the isolated, brought it down so that it could be shared with everyone. Everyone would have access to a car. And in fact, he sold 15 million Model Ts. It held the record for the most number of sales of any car until the Toyota Corolla did it. And it took the Corolla 40 years to do it. It only took Henry Ford 20 years to do it. But there's something else that I'm thinking of. In fact, a few more things. Well, let me put it this way. When you have a car, and it used to be horse and buggy territory, where would you drive that car? Infrastructure. Somebody had to do the infrastructure. There's kind of multiple phases for Henry Ford, and he got to a point where, you know what, the problem is people want cars, and they can maybe afford them, but where are they going to go with them? So he's spending more time with the state officials, with the senators, with Congress, trying to get infrastructure in place. What else do you need that's outside of the box? Yeah.
Anybody can drive the car. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to drive it.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So it's an easy thing to share around with others. Fuel. You need fuel. You need fueling stations. Right now, that's a big topic with like the electric car. Where are you going to fuel up? The hydrogen car, all these things. He had to be a part of that, get close to Standard Oil. And so now you see how complicated a disruption can be, what a big change it can have, and how difficult it is to happen. So it took him 20 years to really make this happen. And I guess part of my point there is that, well, two main things. One is any kind of change takes a lot of people involved, a lot of different parties. And two is it doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time. Well, here's another guy who had disruptive change. And his name is Chuck, Charles Schwab. And I guess the interesting thing about Charles Schwab, he had a radical change on an industry somewhat similar to real estate because it involved brokerages. And he started the discount brokerage. And it took him a long time. His first discount brokerage company was actually 1974. And he didn't make it big until about 1998. And in between there, he actually sold his company to Bank of America in 1983 and then bought it back in 1994 under his name. So these things take time, and there's a lot of change, and in his case, he was in the right place when technology changed. And so some say, you know, for instance, with real estate, well, come on, Jim, like the internet, it's old news. It came around in 1995, really took off in 98. Hey, I must have got an email. Sorry about that. And so, you know, that has all gone by us, but not necessarily so. It does take time for the consumers to get used to the idea, to line up everything in order. And I think that I'm still seeing, well, there's evidence, I guess we've got the converted here, to believe there's still much potential for change in the industry, and I think very positive change. So we'll go into that. Let me define what disruptive change is. Disruptive change, and there's two types, whether technology-based or business model, and the business model would be more for the real estate, is a specific form of environmental change. Specifically, it's a redefinition of a product or service attributes in a manner that is generally perceived as inferior to incumbent product or service providers. So it's, in the case of Henry Ford, it was any color you want as long as it's black. It was everything is standard, you can't have options. But some of the other major low-end disruptors over time, if you look at the retail industry, originally it was a corner store, it was a general store, and then department stores came along. And people felt they were losing some of the small town character of it. And then there was actually a disruption that didn't stick along, which is called catalog retailing. Back in around actually the early 1900s, you could order your house, you could order just about anything you wanted through a catalog, which is kind of interesting because it's a bit of a precursor to what happened 100 years later. And then there was the discount stores like Walmart and Target as a disruption. And then it moved on to the category killers, Toys R Us, Staples, Home Depot, so on and so forth. At each one of these stages, what was being offered, most of the incumbents were saying, don't worry about it, that's inferior, who's going to want that? Much like people say now about mere posting. That's inferior, who's going to want that? That's completely inferior and not where people are going. Another one was Southwest Airlines. They don't offer seats. You couldn't, originally when Southwest Airlines started, you couldn't book a seat in advance. You just show up at the airport, and if you're early enough in line, you get a seat. Otherwise, it's too bad. And people would say, well, that's inferior. Who's going to want that? They're not going to check your luggage. They're not going to take it from one plane to another if you've got connecting flights. In fact, they're not even going to book connecting flights for you. That's inferior. Who wants that? Well, for 30 years, Southwest Air has been the most valuable airline in the world. Market capitalization, higher than KLM, British Air, you name it. Because it's a model that works. So sometimes you've got to think outside the box. The stuff that, where they say it's inferior, it's not necessarily the case. A fellow named Clayton Christensen from Harvard did a lot of study on this. And it was interesting because he studied hard drives for computers. And at first they were like these larger 8-inch things that worked in what we call mini computers. And every engineer, all the research departments are just trying to get more and more memory onto these things. They're focusing on that. And somebody comes into the lab and says, look what I discovered. I can do it in 5 inches using different material. Well, does it have more memory? No, it doesn't. Oh, well, we don't want it. And somebody else would pick it up, and along would come the personal computer. And then the same thing going down to 3-inch. No, we don't want that. It doesn't have more memory. Somebody else would pick up the technology. Along comes a laptop, and so on and so forth. He found actually 6 successive times that the company that actually discovered the innovation, the disruption, rejected it because they felt it was inferior. And within 2 years, it's actually an amazing study, that company either went out of business or was acquired by somebody else.